God with us. Encountering Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. All right, so we're looking at chapter 2 of the book today. I thought it was pretty cool how, he likens the story of Jesus to sort of jumping in a movie, like at the climax and right before the ending scenes. And he does that so that we can see that Jesus is like the climax to this, our long story, the big story of God, and how it's the dramatic conclusion to God's overarching plan from the Old Testament to prepare people for the Messiah. And just how important it is that we realize Jesus's place in our salvation in light of all of these covenants that God continued to make since Adam. Okay, he specifically says that in on page 22 at the top. But I looked back through some information that I had, and I'll post this in the comments after we're done today. But I attended a conference one time, and it was like the Bible in an hour or something. And this guy, it was amazing how he went through and he looked at all of the covenants throughout the Old Testament that culminated with the covenant with Jesus, okay, the new covenant. So all of the Old Testament covenants. And remember, a covenant is an exchange of persons, not just a contract, a promise, or an agreement. It's an exchange of persons. But he talks about, with Adam and Eve in the garden, we were in perfect communion. We were in perfect harmony with God, okay? The creation was a united family of God. And then there was this disobedience which broke that, okay? But it started, so you have this covenant with Adam was one couple, all right? And then, and this is like our broken human family. And then you have the covenant with Noah. Noah was one family. So you have Adam and Eve, which were one couple. Noah was one family. Abraham was the next covenant. That was one tribe. You have Moses was the next covenant, the Mosaic covenant. That was one nation. And then you have the Davidic covenant, and that was the one kingdom. So it's like all of these covenants, they just sort of get bigger, if you will. Like they're more inclusive as this creation in the family of God. God draws us all back into himself, and he just gets bigger and bigger and bigger with his grasp, right? Okay, and I mean, this is just a really cool little pictograph thing that I have drawn up here. It even looks like it was a tree that was the tool of deception in the garden, and it was a tree that was a tool of redemption that Jesus was crucified on, right? And you got the Garden of Eden, and you got the Garden of Gethsemane, but it was that tree essentially that reunited all of God's family into his one huge family, with Jesus being the new covenant. So I'll include this in the comments here whenever we're done today. God made 3 promises to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 22. A nation, a kingdom, and a worldwide blessing. So the nation was fulfilled with Moses, the kingdom was fulfilled with David, and the worldwide blessing was fulfilled with Jesus. Just pretty cool. Just made me think about that whenever I was reading, at the top of page 22, where the author just talks about how how essential it is for us to realize that this story, that Jesus, this climactic end and Jesus with the new covenant, that there's all of this backstory that's really important. That's our history. And of course, again, that more than any other gospel, Matthew makes all those connections to the Old Testament. And so, the author just really explains to us that happens in 2 ways, with explicit fulfillment quotations and then the implicit allusions. Those explicit references that just say to fulfill the prophecy. And then, just like he said, the author basically, the Matthew the evangelist basically cuts and pastes it straight out of the Old Testament. But he spends a lot of time today talking to us about the implicit allusions. And, you know, I really appreciate the way that Dr. Sri does this, because he really does dispel any myths that may be out there that the Old Testament is irrelevant, that because it's the Old Testament it doesn't matter, which is it's just not, that's just not the case. It does matter. You know, Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, all of the Old Testament prophecies, how God's plan of salvation is brought to fulfillment in every detail of Christ's life. The plan of salvation was all of that leading up to Jesus. So pretty neat with those implicit allusions. You know, definitely we have to remember that allusion is based on the assumption that we have all this knowledge, which today, if you're not a scripture scholar, or if you haven't been studying scripture or have a theology degree probably or something, like we're not born in the 21st century. It's not what we learn unless we are intentional about learning the Old Testament. And how he likens that to, you know, these Jewish people, where we would have Netflix or iTunes or baseball or Hollywood, that their popular culture was shaped by the scripture. That's all they did. You know, they lived it. That's what they talked about, what they heard in the synagogue, what they pondered in prayer, and what they celebrated and reenacted in various feasts throughout the year. You know, and it does help us to understand whenever he makes these references to like Star Wars, or, you know, the theme song when you go watch a baseball game. You know, the thing that popped into my mind was like that horn from the Dukes of Hazzard. I can remember whenever I was young in Morganville, I guess there was this car that rode around town that had that horn, and it just would always make you think about the Dukes of Hazzard. You know, I know that's crazy. It's the random things that pop in my head. But, you know, but that's where they would have been. So when they were hearing these references in Matthew, they would have automatically been able to make those connections to the Old Testament. So that's the implicit allusion. They have that background knowledge because that's just what they did, you know, in Jesus's time. You knew the Old Testament. You just knew. You knew the scriptures. He makes several, even in just chapter 2 alone, he makes several instances of those implicit allusions. You know, one of the questions that the author poses in the back are, which one stuck out to you the most? You know, was it the Magi and Balaam? Or, you know, the Herod and Balak, baby Jesus and baby Moses, Joseph and Joseph. But, you know, I mean, how the freedom from what the Moses and Jesus I thought was pretty cool. You know, just when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, and then he, you know, freed those people, and then Jesus frees us from the slavery of sin. We don't have to go back over all of those, you know, but just there were several instances where he shows us this implicit allusion, unpacking the symbolism of that prophecy from the end of Numbers that he talks about on page 27. You know, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Just those few lines there, but just the symbolism. The scepter is a royal staff symbolizing a king who will one day come to Israel. According to this prophecy, a star will be the sign of the king's coming, so that when the Magi see that star in the direction of Israel, they're coming to Jerusalem in search of a king. It would make perfect sense to that first century Israelite. It makes perfect sense to these people. Like I said, it's the validity. They've heard all of this Old Testament, and so what they're hearing, a new word, a new revelation, it makes sense in light of the old, in light of what they've known for centuries, you know, that's been passed on to them orally, you know, because when they would go to temple and they would sit at the foot of the teachers, they hear this new word and it makes sense to them. You know, it's that credibility. In a sense, it says the Magi of the Christmas story are like successors to Balaam. You know, so it's the new makes sense in light of the old. But here we are, you know. How many years did we just believe the new? We didn't even have to really understand the old. It just gives us more depth to the scriptures. It's a new appreciation of the scriptures. It's a new appreciation of Jesus. It's a new dimension. I just feel like, you know, in looking at the questions that the author poses in the back, it's like, it's just this new dimension of Jesus that we get to appreciate. I think about like how many times are we reading scripture and it just seems like Jesus comes up with some random stuff. You know, it's like, well, we wonder where that came from, you know, or it's just random. And perhaps it's because we don't understand the Old Testament, because we don't see necessarily what he's talking about, because we haven't dove into the Old Testament. The Old Testament hasn't been revealed to us or shown to us. Maybe we haven't looked at Jesus in light of the Old Testament. It's just interesting. Why is the Old Testament so important for understanding the story of Jesus? I just noted that it helps us to more fully understand and appreciate all that he says and does. Maybe like it's not so random, you know? So what about you guys? What were your thoughts about the Old Testament before, not even just this chapter, but even the first couple of chapters? Just share a little bit about that. How does Matthew's approach to the Jewish scripture change the way you view the Old Testament now? If you don't mind, share some of your reflection in the comments. What are some things that you can do to know the Old Testament story better? You know, I know for me, anytime I get in the Word, and you know, I'm just like anybody else. Some seasons of my life I spend more time in it, some I spend less time in it, you know. It's a growing process, I think, and you have to be very intentional with it. But, you know, when I do dive into the scripture, I love to read those annotations, you know. I love to read the annotations, and, you know, in my Bible, you've got letters, and so the little letters will reference you back to those parallel verses, if you will, you know, and then there's the little asterisks that just give you these explanations, almost like footnotes. So that really does help me to understand the Old Testament story better. That's the way that I do it, you know. He made several connections with the Old Testament and New Testament. I'd love to hear which one impressed you the most, you know, and why. If you don't mind, please just spend a little bit of time sharing in the comments about that. All right. So for tomorrow morning, let's read the scripture, Matthew chapter 3. It's short, okay? And if you have time, if you want to start reading in the book, chapter 3, go ahead and do that. But for tomorrow, the reflection that we have on here in the morning will be from the scriptures, okay? From Matthew chapter 3. It's short, just 17 verses, okay? In a couple more days, we'll actually end up reading several chapters. And I don't know if you noticed, if you've looked ahead in your books or not, but after the first 4 chapters of the book, it gets to be where it's not so broken up so evenly. So, but for now, I think this speed was good for me to read the Gospels one day and then the chapter of the book and to ponder that the next. So for tomorrow, we'll be looking at Matthew chapter 3. All right, I hope you guys have an amazing Saturday, and I'll see you in the morning at 7 a.m. God bless you.